The greatest advertisement Christianity has in the world today is the exemplary lives of the followers of Christ. One's influence as a Christian is the most valuable contribution he can make to the cause of Christ. The Lord said to his disciples, "You are the light of the world." Again, he said, "You are the salt of the earth." These statements were made with reference to their influence. And as followers of Christ, Christians should realize that they should be an example in Christian living, not only to save themselves, but in order to help save others as well. In 1 Timothy 4 and verse 16, Paul wrote, "Take heed unto thyself and unto the doctrine. Continue in them, for in doing this thou shalt both save thyself and them that hear thee." The subject of our lesson today is taken from 1 Timothy 4 and verse 12. Here the Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy, his son in the faith, and he said, "Be thou an example of the believers, in word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, and in purity." Again he wrote to another, "In all things showing thyself a pattern of good works, in doctrine, showing uncorruptness, gravity, sincerity, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that he that is of the contrary part may be ashamed, having no evil thing to say of you." Titus 2, verses 7 and 8. Paul was encouraging these men to live lives that were above reproach, so that they would give no critic reason to find fault with their claim to be Christians. Paul said to be an example in word. That is the language one uses to express himself. Why? Because Jesus says, "For by thy words thou shalt be justified, and by thy words thou shalt be condemned." Matthew 12 and verse 37. Such a statement should make us realize how important it is to always use language that is becoming a Christian. "For he that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil, and his lips that they speak no guile. Let him eschew evil and do good. Let him seek peace and ensue it." 1 Peter 3 verses 10 and 11. James says, "If any man among you seems to be religious, and bridleth not his tongue, but deceiveth his own heart, this man's religion is vain." James 1 and verse 26. Next, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Be thou an example in conversation." The word conversation in this passage means conduct or manner of life. We're told, "Only let your conversation or your conduct be as it becometh the gospel of Christ." Philippians 1 and verse 27. This leaves no room for misconduct. Paul also teaches us to present our bodies a living sacrifice unto God. Romans 12 and verse 1. And Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, "Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven." Matthew 7 and verse 21. Friends, there are going to be a lot of disappointed people on the day of judgment. Paul also told Timothy to be an example in charity. This word means love. Christians must have the right attitude toward other people if they're going to go to heaven. Jesus taught his followers in John 13 verses 34 and 35, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." It was the Apostle John who said, "My little children, let us not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth." 1 John 3 and verse 18. And Peter said, "Seeing ye have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit unto unfeigned love of the brethren, see that ye love one another with a pure heart fervently." Another thing Paul told Timothy was to be an example of the believers in spirit. The term spirit in this case is the moral disposition and attitude of a person. If an individual is an example of a Christian in spirit, then he has a spiritual attitude. He is not carnally minded. He thinks in a spiritual vein. And with this attitude, he mortifies the deeds of the flesh. Romans 8 and verse 13. He does not walk after the flesh, but after the Spirit. Romans 8 and verse 1. Also, Timothy was told to be an example in faith. The writer of Hebrews tells us, "Without faith it is impossible to please God." Hebrews 11 and verse 6. If a person is an example in faith, it is detectable. His faith is manifested in his actions. He trusts in God, believes in God, and does all things well. For he is a person who walks by faith and not by sight. And finally, Paul told Timothy to be an example of the believers in purity. When we become a child of God, we are to become spiritually clean and pure in the sight of God. A child of God is admonished to keep thyself pure, 1 Timothy 5 and verse 22. Whenever we keep ourselves unspotted from the world will see that we are different and that we're living a life that is devoted to the will of God. Yes, friends, every Christian should strive to be an example so that he can be the influence for good in the world that God intends for His people to be, and we should never be satisfied with our lives until we are. Thank you for joining us for our program today, and have a blessed day.